is the last time I'm going to do an all-out blitz on lots and lots of art. So today we're going to talk about how did the artists and writers of the Romantic movement reflect changes in this era. So I'm sorry to tell you, I'm going to be showing you lots and lots of images of art. Hopefully you find it beautiful. But so the first question, though, is before we start talking about the Romantic era, you got to go back a little bit. How would art appear during the Enlightenment? So art of the Enlightenment is going to be it was referred to as classical because the Enlightenment is the age of reason. So this is why we're going to have a neoclassical movement as a result of the Enlightenment. And Romanticism is going to be a revolt against this classicism of the Enlightenment. So the Romantic movement is going to be 1780 to 1830. And this kind of neoclassical is going to bleed over into the Romantic. So there's going to be a point where like the art of Napoleon and his era is going to be still very reflective of this neoclassical aesthetic. So you see there's going to be kind of these like competing elements of the neoclassicism and the Romanticism. But the classicism, which would be this art of the Enlightenment, goes along with the art Enlightenment's belief in rationality and order and restraint. So it's going to be much more orderly. And in contrast to very much the emotional exuberance of the Romanticism. But the neoclassical writers, again, kind of also focused on the ideas of bringing back the staidness and the symmetry and the rationality and the reason of the classical era. So neoclassicism in France is also an artistic style associated with the French Revolution, with a renewed interest in classical ideas and ideals. It reflected honor, order against stability. And it was used very effectively by Napoleon to associate himself with the Roman emperors. So it was also, in a way, a form of political propaganda. So it was more serious in nature, a reaction against the Rococo, which is very pink and fluffy, and the ideas of Louis XV. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Diderot both spoke of a need for an art that contains a moralizing message. So a lot of the neoclassical period is also kind of influenced by the fact that we're seeing the ruins of Vesuvius being excavated during this time period. So Vesuvius was this large volcano in southern Italy around the city of Naples. It destroyed Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other cities that kind of surrounded. And in the 18th century, these areas began to be excavated. And this really kind of like ignited a interest in classical art and architecture. And it became very fashionable. So we also see a lot of publication of books on antiquity during this time period. The Elgin marbles, which were brought from Greece, they're off the Pantheon. So this guy, Lord Elgin, brought these marbles to the British Museum, and they're still there even today, even though they should, I would think, be returned to Greece since they are, the sculptures that were taken off of the Parthenon in Athens, but they're still in the British Museum today. And this also helped to kind of create this like interest in this classical art. So it is a return to the perceived purity of the arts of Rome to model the ideal of the ancient Greek arts, and in some extent to bring back, the classicism of the Renaissance. And so there's a conviction that there's a permanent universal way things are and should be, which entails fundamental political and ethical commitments. And it is sometimes referred to as anti-modern. So this is a major example of a neoclassical work. This is actually, if you've ever been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, if you take the main staircase up to the second floor galleries, this is right at the top of the stairs. So this is Jean-Louis David's image of the death of Socrates. So David was politically active in the French Revolution. He was a member of the Jacobin Party. And he painted classical themes like the death of Socrates to incite nationalism and to identify with classical ideals. So this is Socrates, and he was found guilty of, Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher, and he was found guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens, I believe, was the charge that he was found guilty of, and his punishment was to take a cup of hemlock and commit suicide, basically. And here he does it because this is what the government is telling him to do. Another example of neoclassicism, the Oath of Horati, reflects the Republican ideas of government, counter to the monarchy, and symbolizes loyalty at any cost, and very stable and orderly composition with many verticals in the painting, kind of adding to that stability and order. Another example, the Oath of Brutus. The oath was sworn as a promise of individual revenge against a corrupt monarchy. This is another example of neoclassicism, which is the Consecration of Napoleon and Josephine, also by David, the celebration of worldly splendor and power. And notice how they're all dressed in togas, like they're back in ancient Greece. Even the classical style at the time, if you've ever seen a Jane Austen novel, you'll see, or a Jane Austen movie, I should say, you'll see that the women always wear these dresses that kind of look like nightgowns. They're not very big and poofy like we'll see during the Victorian era. And they kind of almost like mimic the idea of like a toga. It's kind of this idea coming back to style. This also reflects in the architecture of the time. This is the Royal Crescent at Bath. Bath is a city in England that was seen as a like summer resort for the wealthy. It's called Bath because it's built around a set of ancient Roman baths. And these are all townhouses for the upper class. So the empire style is kind of this reflection of this. So Napoleon, this was Napoleon's official architects, the Fontaines. They remade Paris in the intimidating opulence of the Roman imperial architectural style. So like the Arc de Triomphe that was built during this time period. The British Museum also reflects this. The Bank of England reflects this. The Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, Buckingham Palace in London. All of these reflect this neoclassical style. By the mid-19th century, several European cities were transformed into veritable museums of neoclassical architecture. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., it's another example of it. So the Capitol, our Capitol building, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, all of this is examples of neoclassicism. So that brings us to its counterpoint, which is Romanticism. So Romanticism is emotional exuberance, it's spontaneity, it's against the rationality of the neoclassical. So the Romantic movement appeared in England and France, at least in literature, as early as the 17th century. And Romantics like to use religion as basic to human nature, and they wanted to see a revival of Christianity. The Romantics were also referred to as the storm and stress group. Because they believed in emotional intensity. So you can hear some of the spirit of the age of the Romanticism. They also had early support of the French Revolution, but they felt that the rise of the individual led to alienation. They're very against the dehumanization of industrialization. And they have an obsession with violent change. Again, think storm and stress rather than necessarily thinking Romanticism. So paintings are typically set in long ago and faraway places, encompassing a variety of past styles, going back to like medieval times. It was considered the first modern art movement and the looseness of the brushstrokes, which I'll talk about in a second. Edmund Burke was a philosopher and social critic who wrote about what he said as the sublime, and he saw unfinished and preparatory works as superior to the finished works because they allowed the viewer to kind of include their own thoughts and their own interpretation. So some of the characteristics of the Romantic movement, again, emotion, passion, irrationality, a distrust of reason. So you have the Enlightenment, which is reason and orderly and stability, and Romanticism is like everything that's not. So the essence of the human experience is subjective, it's emotional, and human knowledge is a puny thing compared to the other great historical forces. Individual rights are dangerous efforts at selfishness, and the community is more important. So again, this is everything that the Enlightenment is not. So the Romantic movement began in the 1790s. It peaks in the 1820s. It's mostly in Northern Europe, in particular Britain and Germany. It's a reaction against classicism and the idea of the romantic hero, one of the greatest examples being Lord Byron. He was a very famous poet. He was tremendously popular among the reading public of Europe. And he felt the youth intimidated his haughtiness and rebelliousness. So, this idea of the artist is someone who's apart from society, and the artist is a social critic and a revolutionary, and also that the artist is a genius. So the artists were fascinated by dreams and hallucinations, and this suggested an existence of a world beyond empirical observation. Many of them lived kind of bohemian lives where they would have long uncombed hair. They rejected materialism, and they thought that they could gain, lofty heights through their art. And they believed that the full development of the human potential was the supreme purpose in life. So here you can see, this is a very famous example of Romantic painting, Caspar David Friedrich's The Wandering Above the Sea of Fog, and you can't see his face, and he's kind of looking out into the world, and the fog is in essence also is kind of very emotional. And again, this loose brush strokes was kind of as a nod to eventually going to become the Impressionist movement. Again, topics of either fanciful topics, going to the areas of the superstitious or supernatural, because Lady Macbeth kind of goes crazy towards the end, haunted by the idea that her and her husband killed the King of Scotland, and she is convinced that the blood is still on her hands. So the idea of human emotion and kind of like the darker levels of human emotion, again, the storm and stress movement becomes very prominent in Romanticism. So the idea of the rugged individual as the dreamer, individuals having unique and endless potential and self-realization that comes through art. So things like the dreamer, the rugged individual, the solitary tree. The power of nature is also something that becomes very important during this time period. So this idea that nature can have peaceful and restorative qualities, but that it also can have an awesome and powerful aspects, like the horrifying aspects of nature, like storms and shipwrecks, and how nature is indifferent to the fate of humans, and that we really, can't compete against nature. So an avalanche, a deluge, the Tree of Crows, a shipwreck. Like I said, shipwrecks tend to be something that comes up a lot in Romantic paintings, kind of just showing the power and force of nature. This painting here, The Raft of Medusa, is a very famous Romantic work. I'll move the description in a second so you can see the bottom. It was about a real-life tragedy that involved a shipwreck at sea and its survivors. And it's a symbol of political injustice because the captain, who was appointed by Napoleon, abandons the ship, and he leaves 149 passengers on one small raft. And the artist researched this painting. He interviewed survivors. So I'll move this a little bit so you can kind of see. Sorry. Come on, move. So you can kind of see them kind of struggling to survive on this small raft as abandoned by the captain of the ship, who's supposed to go down with his ship. The eruption of Vesuvius, again, because of the excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum, this kind of like interest becomes reignited in things like Mount Vesuvius, which led to the destruction of these cities. This idea that technology is dehumanizing. So this is a movement against the Industrial Revolution. So Rain, Steam, and Speed by Turner. And again, this is very impressionistic. You don't fully see the railroad. You just get the essence of the railroad kind of coming at you. You kind of see a little bit of a bridge here and a boat here, but you don't fully see it. So this is why it's also considered one of the earliest modern art movements. There you can see a little bit of the detail of the train and how loosely the train is painted. The slave ship. Sorry, I skipped over. That's the painting called The Slave Ship. And again, you could see the detail of the people. So because they want to reject industrial progress, they want to go back to a more simpler time. So they tend to romanticize country life. So lots of bucolic scenes of rural life or landscape also becomes part of the Romantic movement. And then romanticizing the Middle Ages, this revival of past styles. So we're going to see a Gothic and Romanesque revival, which is the art of the Middle Ages. And medieval ruins become a favorite theme. So people that are wealthy would build like fake ruins in their gardens. This is a very famous Romantic painting. It's showing the death of Lady Jane Grey, the sacrifice she had made. She was queen for like 8 weeks in between Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. But we also see this Romantic landscape painting reflecting Gothic architecture. This is a view of Salisbury Cathedral in England. Another view of Salisbury Cathedral. So again, ruins become something that also becomes very interest because nature kind of taking over things that human built, but while glorifying the past. The British House of Parliament, which is a neo-Gothic architectural style, also reflects this Romantic movement. So the exotic, the occult, and the macabre. So supernatural, which we're back to what I showed you with that image of Lady Macbeth. So ghosts, fairies, witches, demons, the shadows of the mind, dreams, and madness. The Romantics rejected materialism in pursuit of spiritual self-awareness. So kind of, this is an example, an interest in psychology, the political revolt. The great red dragon and the woman clothed with the sun. This is William Blake, who is also a poet. Nightmare, which is Sabbath. Even though by this point the Enlightenment kind of leads to the rejection of the ideas of witchcraft. Now this idea kind of brings it back. Saturn devouring his son. Romanticism is also reflective in the ideas of nationalism. So Greece on the Ruins of Mussolini by Delacroix. This is probably Delacroix's most famous painting, Liberty Leading the People in 1830. And you can see detail of that. So nationalism is going to also become part of this. This is a painting that's very famous. This idea of the 12th of May, 3rd of May, excuse me, emphasizing Spanish nationalism over the French. And so another part of the Romantic movement are going to be Brothers Grimm's fairy tales and Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, which they went around and spoke to various different peasants throughout Germany and recorded these tales that had been told for centuries, passed down orally, and used those as a way to bring together a sense of German nationalism. So an interest in exotic and foreign lands, this idea of the sexy other, and a sense of escape from reality, and also in some ways a justification for imperialism. So we see painting of what would be considered like exotic lands to the people of Europe. So this is Tangiers in North Africa, the Sultan of Morocco, another painting by Delacroix, the Turkish bath, again, the sexy other. A bullfight by Goya. And then that also becomes reflective in the architecture. So this is the pavilion at Brighton. Brighton was a beach community in England. And this was a royal palace. And it's very much reflective of this, the onion domes, more of Middle Eastern style architecture. So how would Rousseau influence the Romantics? Rousseau is such a complex figure because he's Romantic but also enlightened. But he believed that society and material prosperity corrupted human nature. And so he felt that humankind was basically happy and innocent by nature. So in his book, Emily, he writes about the difference between children and adults. And he felt that children should be raised in the maximum individual freedom, to be allowed to grow freely. And he vindicated the rights of nature over society, which is in contrast to the ideas of Kant, who argued for subjective character of human knowledge. And he felt that all humans have a sense of moral duty. So he's going to be more of the neoclassical elements. So why would Romantics reject modern life? So Romantics felt that the growth of modern industry was ugly and it was a brutal attack on human nature and personality. And they wanted to escape in natural surroundings. And so they idealized the Middle Ages. They liked art, literature, architecture of the medieval times. And they focused on things like the folklore and the folk songs and the fairy tales, like I mentioned before. And they saw the industrial landscape and the factories, they saw that as like the flames of hell. They were fascinated by color and diversity, and they focused more on history. They felt history should not be a minor branch of philosophy, but important in their own right. And this is where we see historical studies supporting the development of nationalism. So Britain is the first country where Romanticism appeared in poetry and appeared in writing. And so basically, some of the Romantics found a fascination with history and the spirit of bygone eras and historical events. So, for instance, Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables, but also wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, are definitely examples of Romanticism. Now, Victor Hugo was the son of a Napoleonic general, but his novels have a romantic fascination with fantastic characters and strange settings and human emotions, which you would see in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He renounced conservatism and he equated freedom in literature with liberty, politics, and society. Another famous romantic author was this woman here. Her pen name was George Sand. She left her husband to pursue a career, and she wrote 80 novels focusing on romantic love of nature, moral, and idealism. And today I would guess we would refer to her as transgender because she dressed like a man and she smoked cigars and she presented herself as a man. But we also see in this time period in Eastern Europe, literary romanticism and early nationalism are basically reinforcing each other, like what I said before with the fairy tales. So some other famous romantics I mentioned before, Delacroix, I showed you his painting Liberty Leading His People. Possibly the illegitimate son of Talleyrand. Talleyrand was a French government official. He actually was the French representative at the Congress of Vienna. But Delacroix, I'll go back to one of the, do I have it? Well, Delacroix was known for his colorful scenes that would stir emotions. And then we also have Turner and Constable. I showed you images of theirs before. They were fascinated by nature. Another famous example of romanticism would be in the areas of music, known as Beethoven, like in particular Beethoven, is an example of a romantic music, where music realized fully and permanently the goals of free expression and emotional intensity. So the size of the orchestra was tripled during this time period, adding a wind section, a percussion section, and a brass section. And musicians began to earn greater prestige. Another example would be Franz Liszt, which are these very dramatic compositions of music. So some of the great novels that were written during this time, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, they were sisters. Ivanhoe, Les Miserables, The Three Musketeers by Dumas. Frankenstein, which is considered one of the first works of science fiction by Mary Shelley, who is the Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter. Dracula was written during this time period. Some of the other romantic writers, the Brothers Grimm, some romantic poets, Shelley, Byron, Coleridge. Shelley, by the way, is Mary Shelley's father. John Keats, William Blake. Lord Byron was another famous poet. So last question, how is the Methodist religion a reflection of romantic ideas? So the Methodist Church originated in the mid-18th century as a revolt against deism and the rationalism of the Church of England. The leader was a man by the name of John Wesley, and his message was focused on repentance and good works. By the late 18th century, it becomes a separate church, having its greatest success and influence actually in the Americas. And it stressed inward, heartfelt heartfelt religion and possibility of a Christian perfection in life. And it emphasized the role of an enthusiastic and emotional experience in church. So the political implications of Romanticism, before I let you guys go. Romanticism could reinforce the greatest themes of political liberalism or political conservatism. It contributed to the growing nationalist movements and the concept of the vogue or the people, and the uniqueness of cultures were emphasized. Again, where this comes into the idea of nationalism. So why did the Romantics express themselves in the way they did, and how were they a rejection of the Enlightenment and industrialization?